Yes, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's session of our fall series, Living a Life of Meaning, which, as you know, but I'll say in case they're first timers with us today, the series is responding to the intense disruption that we're all experiencing in our normal lives, and for many of us, close encounters with mortality. And our JTS faculty and fellows are leading us through this process of evaluating what's truly important in our lives, exploring the role of values and ethics and Torah in our quest for a well-lived and meaningful life. So welcome to everyone, and especially to first-time attendees. And you can view recordings of past sessions using the link in the email that you received from Lynn Feynman this morning, which also had the link to the source sheet for today. I'm really so pleased about today's faculty member, my teacher and colleague, Rabbi Mychal Springer, who is now the manager of clinical pastoral education at York-Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, and an adjunct professor at JTS. But as you may have seen from her bio on the source sheet, she, after serving as an associate dean of the rabbinical school at JTS for several years, which is how she came into my life, she founded and then led for 10 years JTS's Center for Pastoral Education. So she is a master when it comes to looking at Torah through the lens of pastoral care and our human needs and how we can help each other. So we're so thrilled to have her teaching today. Her session is entitled The Wholeness of a Broken Heart, and we'll be looking at the Kotzker Rebbe. So on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Tani to guide us through some logistics, and then we will learn from Rabbi Springer.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi Andelman. So just to go over a couple of the logistics for the session, Rabbi Springer will pause for questions periodically throughout the class, and we also have a Q&A period at the end. You can use the chat feature to submit your question to Rabbi Julia Andelman. To open the chat, hover your cursor over the bottom of the Zoom screen and click on the chat icon. During the Q&A period, Julia will select a few of the questions to present to Rabbi Springer. Please note that you will only be able to chat with JTS staff. You will not be able to send messages to the group or to Rabbi Springer directly. For technical and logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with myself or Lynn Feynman. With the exception that Rabbi Springer will also be initiating some interaction with us today. So she'll be inviting us at several times throughout the session to chat with the group, and she'll let us know when we're able to do that. For those of you who have called in only, you will unfortunately not be able to ask a question. You can consider joining via Zoom for future sessions. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received with the Zoom link for the session. We'll also post a link shortly in the chat. And I'm pleased to go ahead and turn it over now to Rabbi Springer.
Now you can hear me, right? All right. So I just said thank you to Rabbi Andelman for your beautiful introduction, and to Tani for inviting me to be here. It is wonderful to see so many faces. I took a tour of all the different screens. There are currently 13 screens on my computer, so I'm sorry that I can't see all your faces simultaneously while I'm talking. I noticed a lot of people that I've never met before, and a lot of people who are very dear to me. So it's quite a pleasure to be in this space with all of you. So maybe just a word about what I've been up to, and then we'll come into our texts. As the manager of clinical pastoral education here at York-Presbyterian, I have a really large and wonderful educational program that I run with residents who are full-time employees for a year while they do their training towards certification, and interns who are with us either part-time during the year or full-time during the summer. Last summer, we had to cancel our program because we just couldn't have interns in the hospital. The residents were here with me, but we couldn't have interns in the hospital. And so starting in the spring, I had the opportunity to serve as the acting rabbi here at Weill Cornell Medical Center in the peak of COVID. And it was an incredible honor. And I know we've all experienced so much since March, since Purim, sort of mark time since Purim. And as we come into these texts, I'm just holding that with me, and lots of love for the larger world, for all of humanity, for the incredible people that I've had the chance to journey with during times that have stretched us in unimaginable ways. So our first text is from Menachem Mendel of Kotzk, otherwise known as the Kotzker Rebbe. And he taught that nothing is more whole than a broken heart. So I don't know if Tani stepped away and Rabbi Andelman, there you are. So what I'd like to do is open up the chat and just see from everyone who chooses to participate, what is your first reaction when you encounter this text, whether you're encountering it for the first time or encountering it after a hiatus. Nothing is more whole than a broken heart. Counterintuitive. All right, let me get my chat on the side so I can see everybody there. I didn't realize how whole I am. And comforting, true, it doesn't make sense. I love that. I love that true and it doesn't make sense are right next to each other. A broken heart needs to heal. Makes a lot of sense. Living with the paradox. All right, I'm just gonna scroll back up. Love and love lost. Judaism always seeks to find the positive in everything in life. Etching out a heart of compassion, apparent contradiction, honest or real but whole with a question mark, makes total sense. I am large and I contain contradictions, from Walt Whitman. Paradox. Nothing is more real than a broken heart. You are truly open, absolutely correct. Learning from pain enables empathy and perhaps insight. A broken heart is full of the feelings that have broken it. Somewhat perplexing, but reminds me of the myth of the wounded healer. You have to be broken to be able to heal. Only when one experiences brokenness can you understand another's brokenness. Naomi Shemer, did she sing a song about this line? I gotta go look for that. Loss makes you understand everything. It is an opportunity to put everything into perspective. Redefining wholeness offers a place for self-compassion. The Japanese style of art. I can't say I understand that one. I have to brush up on my Japanese art. But okay, I love that. Add to my repertoire there. Hearts need to break to become wholly human. Glad to know I'm whole, even if it doesn't feel completely healed. Okay, and you can all see these chats, right? Yeah, okay, they're beautiful. Maybe wholeness doesn't need to be literal, painful. Life as a whole is broken, so is the whole of life. The half is always looking for the whole. Okay, so there's a lot of wisdom here. Great. Embraces our humanity, allows us to, at times, to feel broken. Pain is part of life. A broken heart gives me a feeling of inadequacy, flaws, shame, sadness, and much more. Yes. Okay, thank you. Oh, and Larry sent us all the link to the Japanese art. Thank you, Larry. There's a Japanese style that reconstructs broken bowls with repair seams that are beautiful and stand out. Yes, right. Now I remember that. Right, where it's not whole until it's been broken and rebuilt with the seams. Nice. Oh, somebody else put that in too. Thank you, Cheryl. Kintsugi. Beautiful. And somebody can't see the text. All right. So you all have said quite a lot about what it means that nothing is more whole than a broken heart. And I think about Leonard Cohen saying there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. So we want to be careful in embracing this paradox, not to in any way diminish the pain that's real, while also being open to the possibilities that inhere even in the brokenness. That's the challenge, because when somebody's heart is broken and we come along and say with equanimity, nothing's more whole than a broken heart, well, to that person, I would want to punch that person in the face. So it's not something that can be said with equanimity or smugness or don't worry, your brokenness will turn into wholeness. That's how we miss people in their pain. But when we can hold this saying gently and wonder about what it can mean for each of us, actually, then I think the possibilities emerge. So that's really important to me. Not to forget about the reality of that brokenness. So Estelle Frankel wrote a book, and you see a couple of quotes from her book, Sacred Therapy, Jewish Spiritual Teachings on Emotional Healing and Inner Wholeness. And her whole book is grounded in Kabbalah and mystical teachings. And the sentence that I first quote here is, from the mystical perspective, reality is always both broken and perfect all at once. So you may be familiar with the Kabbalistic teaching that God was the Ein Sof, is the Ein Sof, the without end. And God was moved to create. And in the created vessels to hold God's light as God contracted into Tzimtzum. And those vessels broke. The vessels that contain God's light broke. And so in the Lurianic Kabbalah, in the creation story, creation begins with that breaking. It's nice to have the Japanese, looking for the Kintsugi image, that creation is impossible without brokenness. And for many of us in our worst suffering, we might be inclined to wish for a creation without brokenness. So I think it's a great teaching from Lurianic Kabbalah that there is no such thing. It just turns reality from something that we could wish to have be different than it is to a deep embrace of what is, with the promise that what is holds meaning. Often in the hospital, people may ask, why is this happening? Why is God doing this to me? What is the meaning? And more than anything, that question is a cry of suffering, and a cry that in the articulation of it and the experience of it, that meaning is obliterated. So in a very fundamental way, this teaching about nothing is more whole than a broken heart is a reassurance that no matter what the brokenness is, the possibility of meaning has not been destroyed. Now again, not a meaning that somebody gives to somebody else, There's a violence that happens there, but a possibility of meaning that each of us can move into over time with a gentleness and our own ability to say, for me, that is meaningful, or for me, that is not meaningful. So when Estelle Frankel writes, from the mystical perspective, reality is always both broken and perfect all at once. It's a move away from a binary. Brokenness doesn't preclude wholeness. Brokenness includes wholeness. Now, that may feel very paradoxical. So what does it mean that reality is always broken and perfect all at once? The texts that I put together here give us an opportunity to explore both a personal experience and a Jewish experience of holding brokenness and wholeness together. So the next text that I put in here, I will read to you, also from Estelle Frankel. The fact that darkness is the womb from which all life emerges is understood by the Kabbalah to have deep spiritual significance. It implies an understanding that creation in all its forms emerges out of its opposite, the state of emptiness. All life moves in cycles from darkness into light, from contraction into expansion, brokenness into wholeness. In the symbolism of the Kabbalah, the darkness of night is associated with the fragmented state known as exile, the state of being disconnected and dislocated from one's true place. So I love that the image here is the image of the womb. So the womb is that dark place from which creation emerges, the womanness. As somebody who experienced infertility for years, I always approach the womb with some trepidation, because I don't assume that it's always a friendly image. It can be a source of great suffering. And the first clinical placement that I had as a chaplain when I was an intern myself was at Memorial Sloan Kettering, where I was the chaplain to the ovarian cancer floor, where the womb was the seat of the illness, was the seat of the suffering, and for many women for whom I cared, led to their early deaths. So I don't want to pretty up what it means that life comes from the womb. And here, what I love about what Estelle Frankel does is that when she says that creation in all its forms emerges out of its opposite, the state of emptiness. So in Judaism, the empty womb is one of our most fertile images, right, to come to paradox. It's the barren women who are our matriarchs. Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, the wombs that won't give fruit and only with God's opening opens into. Hannah. So why do we tell those stories? Because coming into life is not something that we take for granted. We have a recognition that we begin in the emptiness, and that creation, out of the tohu vavohu, out of the chaos, then comes the creation. And when we start to embrace this understanding of the way that all creation comes into being, then it makes it less random to say that wholeness and brokenness are interrelated, because we see that all creation begins in that chaotic nothingness, and somehow from the nothingness comes a something. And that's the theme that we're going to be playing with throughout our time today. So we have the brokenness and the wholeness. And then she winds up saying that the darkness of night is associated with the fragmented state known as exile. So for me, exile is my theme from earliest childhood. In pastoral care, we invite, as in our education, we invite people to explore their signature themes. So for me, exile is my signature theme. Growing up as a child, I always felt that I was in the wrong place and the wrong time. And partly, it was a Jewish existential crisis. My mother was born in Tel Aviv, in Palestine, in 1930. It's her birthday this week. She's no longer alive. And she was in the Haganah. She learned how to swallow paper. I didn't learn this until we sat Shiva for her, but part of her spy training, she learned how to swallow paper in case there were secrets that people were trying to get out of her. And after the establishment of the State of Israel, which she so wonderfully participated in, she came to serve here in this country for her boss, Chaim Herzog, who went on to become the president of Israel. And he asked her to join him at the Israeli embassy in 1953. And so out of this beautiful invitation came the reality of a life in exile for somebody who always imagined that she would remain in that place that she helped to establish. And there's the paradox that our lives go in directions that we don't foresee, that we might make plans, and yet it's the taking the left turn that leads us into a path, sometimes with pain and sometimes with joy, but maybe with the loss of the dream that we thought we would realize, and the possibility of realizing a different dream. And so as a child, I inherited my mother's exile. It was in my milk as a young child. And I grew up with a perfect alignment of Jewish historical exile and very personal exile. That was also my story in the periods when I went into depression, which I have experienced at times in my life. And so when I read this about the darkness of the night being associated with exile, I carry in my reading of it an awareness of the fruitfulness of exile as a reality that has sustained us as the Jewish people, both because it has anchored our identity in the reality that we are not of this place, unless some of you are joining us from Eretz Yisrael, but we are not of this place. And even those of us who are in Eretz Yisrael are partook of an exile and a coming back into a place that could never just be the place of that wholeness of our original time in the land, which in itself was not pristine. So I'll return to that a little bit later. So what I want to do is shift into our most famous poem of exile, and invite you to think about Psalm 137 by the rivers of Babylon, both as a Jewish experience of physical exile and a deeply personal experience of that darkness that disorients us and dislocates us from a sense of home, which is another way of talking about the brokenness, the broken consciousness that comes from not being at home in a single place. So, Psalm 137. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we thought of Zion. Al neharot Bavel. Sham yashavnu gam bachinu v'zochrenu et Zion. There on the poplars we hung up our lyres, for our captors asked us there for songs, our tormentors for amusement. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How can we sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem's fall, how they cried, strip her to her very foundations. Fair Babylon, you predator, a blessing on him who repays you in kind what you have inflicted on us. A blessing on him who seizes your babies and dashes them against the rocks. So this psalm of exile is devastating, and we keep it close to us because of the sacredness of being connected to that devastation. Now, some people might say, well, that's just a cruel orientation to keeping ourselves suffering. But actually, I think there's a liberation from recognizing that suffering lives in our hearts and shouldn't be ignored. So when we say, how can I sing a song of the Lord on alien soil? How can I find orientation in the midst of disorientation? The asking of the question itself hints that we need to find some way of continuing to live. But letting it be voiced in the form of the question is allowing it to be a lament in feeling the impossibility of it and having a hope that as I talk about it not being possible, maybe I find a little bit of strength in myself that will make it a tiny bit more possible. So I want to look at verse 6 that says, let my tongue stick to my palate if I cease to think of you, if I do not keep Jerusalem in memory, even at my happiest hour. So there's our paradox again, that at my happiest hour, when one might be inclined to say, let's forget some of the sorrow that we've known, at my happiest hour, I have to keep my sorrow closest to me. And not just any sorrow, the sorrow of being cast into exile, the sorrow of the disorientation. Now, why? Why would it be important to keep the disorientation close in the moment of great happiness? So that's a question that we can all ponder. What I would say here is that our happiness is not full happiness when it's deracinated, when it's cut off from where we come from. So when I keep in mind the exile that I'm living in at the moment of my happiness, I am reminding myself of the greater possibility of a fuller orientation that I may not be living in now, but I have a relationship to. And for those of us who are not able to feel the wholeness in the brokenness, there is a promise that the wholeness exists, that it is still there, it is still in the world somewhere. And we have to remain tied to it as part of our commitment to seeing the possibilities, even in our lowest lows. This psalm brings home the importance of memory and the way that memory sustains us in our exile. Memory that we are loved, memory of a wholeness, memory of a home, a place, knowing that this moment contains where we've been and points us to where we are yet to be. So the next text that I want to look at is from Mychal Fishbein's Sacred Attunement. And by way of introduction, when I was in rabbinical school, I was in a class taught by Ed Greenstein, and he had us read an article by Mychal Fishbein, which was about the sacred center. It was one of the most brilliant articles I've ever read. It should have been a dry biblical scholarship article, but it wasn't. It was sublime. And what Fishbein wrote in that article is that the whole Bible is about the sacred center and being exiled from the sacred center. So it's a very close analysis of the entire Bible, starting with the story of the Garden of Eden, and how from our earliest stories, we are wrestling with the experience of exile and that yearning for the sacred center. So, of course, I've been a fan ever since. Pastoral care is all about that journey towards the sacred center for those of us who feel in exile, and recognizing that the experiences of being in exile are not marginal. They are, in fact, intrinsic and at the center of human experience. So when we are feeling most alone and cast out, this theology helps us recognize that, in fact, our aloneness and our alienation and our exile is what Estelle Frankel would call nothing special. It binds us to everybody else if we're brave enough to speak that language and invite others in. Okay, so now sacred attunement. And we're joining midstream. But then it may happen that the thoughtless ordinariness of daily life is jolted and gives way to a more elemental specificity. Suddenly, something occurs that claims us with an overwhelming intensity and floods our sensibilities without any accompanying thoughts of its human meaning. Rather, the sense of rupture is all, and it seems as if primordial energies have burst from the depths and ripped the veil normally stretched over things, concealing them in blandness. Such moments may occur within the bounds of nature, as with the uprush of some overwhelming vista or sound. They may happen in the human world, as with the unsettling impact of sudden death or love. They may happen through the creations of culture, as with the capacity of certain compositions to propel us to the edge of sensibility. We then shudder before what is given to us from the fullness of phenomenal existence, manifesting mysteries of the surge of things at the core of world being. I'm going to stop there because it's really hard, and I'll come back and keep working with it. So for those of you who want a little bit of interpretation, the sense of rupture. So we're going about our ordinary business. We're just in the ordinary day-to-dayness of our lives. And suddenly we're stopped short by a rupture, by something that pulls away the veil of normalcy, that pulls away this sense that everything is just going about its ordinary existence. And we are put in touch with something that calls us into ourselves and out of ourselves in ways that we couldn't have anticipated. Perhaps it literally takes our breath away. So for those of us who are synagogue goers, sometimes that happens in communal worship. And often it happens in loss, and sometimes it happens in joy. And that is the moment of our heart exploding into something that we didn't have access to before. And the rupture puts us in touch with something that exists beyond ourselves, that maybe we understand its meaning and maybe we don't, but it calls us into our lives in a new way. It calls us out of the ordinariness into a deeper understanding, a new path, a something that asks us to show up for our lives with a recognition of what it means to be mortal, to have been created and to be destined to die. That's the rupture. I'm gonna, when I'm done reading this, I'm gonna ask Tani to open the chat again so I can hear responses from you as we're going along. So let me read the second half of this. Oh, so before I do, I just want to look at that word surge. So those of us in New York know that we are starting our new surge. It's a whole new use of the word surge. I don't think I'll ever encounter that word in the same way again. And so when I reread this passage, manifesting mysteries of the surge of things at the core of world being, I think when a new virus bubbles up and has such a profound effect on the entire human world, we do have a sense of something surging out of nothingness into becoming quite something that we never dreamt of, that we weren't prepared for, and that pushes us to understand our existence in new ways. So then I'll continue. Just here is an absolute somethingness, pulsing in elemental specificity, for we suddenly sense the raw plentitude of existence. But here too, simultaneously, it seems, is a revelation of primordial nothingness, yawning like an inconceivable chasm of invulnerable silence in which cataclysms of galaxies rave mute as amber. For we also sense that the event is in excess of human meaning. In time, we come back to our normal selves, and when we do, we more knowingly confirm this happening in ourselves as well, answering the ever-present question, Ayeka, where are you? With the confession, Hineni, here I am, just here. On such occasions, consequent to the restabilization of consciousness, a renewed subjectivity is aroused in us, the here I am, together with an awakened sense of the great immensity in which we are suffused, now experienced at a particular time and place, the just here. So Fishbein is holding these opposites together, this somethingness and primordial nothingness that is awakened out of this experience of the veil being pulled aside. Trauma pulls that veil aside. Sometimes exquisite beauty pulls that veil aside, and we are put in touch with something, what he says, in excess of human meaning, something that goes beyond us, and that calls to us, asking us, Ayeka, and that's the question that human beings are asked to account for ourselves. Where are you? Where are you really? What is your life? So the devastation of the broken heart also is that opportunity for the clarification that calls us to say, here I am, so that our whole life doesn't go by and we haven't shown up for it. It's these moments of the rupture that ask the question, where are you? And give us the opportunity to figure out what it means for each of us individually and as part of something larger than ourselves to respond. Here I am. Okay, we are ready for your chat.
So Rabbi Springer, we have a lot of questions that have come in already. Do you want, maybe I'll pose some of those to you before we?
Yeah.
Okay. So, okay. So many different directions to go in here. So Naomi Brunlerman is kind of wishing that we had ways to share this kind of Jewish spiritual message more widely, because the culture of social media, as we all know today, really wants to accentuate the opposite, that we don't advertise our brokenness other than sort of small kosher bits of brokenness, and rather the cultural thinking overall is that that brokenness is problematic in a lot of ways and stigmatized. And she went into some legal stuff that I don't understand. I'm sorry, Naomi, but that's the overall point that she's raising. If you want to respond to that.
So one of the pleasures of being 55 is that I have been liberated never to be on social media. I see a thumbs up. Yeah, I think it's really damaging for being able to be in touch with one's whole self. I know that it does a lot of great things in terms of overcoming isolation, but the need to spin one's story in particular ways is really harmful.
I think we can ask the question more broadly than social media, though, also, right? Sort of we're not seeing each other very much now, but, in our normal lives, going around interacting with each other, we don't advertise the pain that we're going through, all the things that have gone wrong.
I don't know. When I went for a walk on Shabbos, I came out of my apartment and I ran into a friend of mine in the building I hadn't seen in a while. And then on the street, I ran into another friend of mine that I hadn't seen in a while. It was like we were little squirrels coming out after hibernation, just for a little breath of fresh air. And as we looked at each other, all we had to do was look in each other's eyes to know how much we're all suffering. So people will say to me, "How are you doing?" And on the one hand, day to day, I'm okay, thank God. But very profoundly, what will the day bring? What will the next day bring? How much are we holding? How much loss and suffering? And if we don't know how to look at one another and acknowledge where we actually are, well, that for me, that would be the greatest loneliness.
I do think that an interesting outgrowth of this pandemic, when we sort of all know that everyone's suffering, is that people are more, I think people have gotten more comfortable being honest in response to the question, how are you? So we had a question from Richard Oppenheim about, he was looking at the end of the Psalm and feeling uncomfortable with kind of the angry, vengeful direction it goes in at the end. If you want to comment on that.
Definitely. I think that anger is really important. It's also hard. I mean, the way that this anger moves towards wanting revenge is hard. But I think that if we don't acknowledge our anger and we don't acknowledge our desire for revenge, for justice, then we end up taking it out on others. So the articulation of the feelings in a psalm is our safest way. The denial of it as an aspect of human experience is our most dangerous way. So there are predators in this world. There are people who inflict harm. We have to know how to create more safety for ourselves and others in the face of those who wish to do evil. We have to be in touch with our desire to restore balance in the brokenness, and of our limited ability to do it ourselves. So there is a great violence to wishing for babies to be dashed against the rocks. That's true. And if people were actually going around dashing those babies against the rocks, I would be very concerned. But holding people in our anguish sometimes means holding people in our anger, holding us in our ugliness in the ugliness of what we are experiencing inside, and finding ways of having it be not exiled.
Thank you. A few people have been raising the brokenness of our country for those who are in the United States. Interested to hear if you think this can be applied.
Well, we've now experienced 4 years of the country being torn, with people who find it hard to even voice disagreements and be embracing of one another across those differences. And as we've seen from the most recent election, the sense that each side knows what's right and the other side is evil is a great danger. So we have a lot of suffering for so many reasons. And the optimistic notion that there's wholeness in our brokenness is a great antidote to a lot of the political forecasters who say that our democracy is breaking apart and that it's time for civil war. So my work with the students is holding difference. I take in students from many different backgrounds. I'm very proud of the ethnic, racial, religious, sexual orientation, gender identity, diversity among the students. And sometimes it's really hard to hold those differences face to face, because we can feel that the other person is a threat to us, is dangerous, but much in line with what I was just saying about that articulation of the desire to dash the babies. We have to find ways to listen to one another, to hear the hurts without covering it over, and not to allow anybody to be pushed outside the camp, because it's only as we hear one another that we can do the healing that grows out of a belief that even in the brokenness, there is great wholeness.
Thank you. And just really in keeping with what you were just saying, we had a nice comment from John Freiberg about how our tradition shows a spiritual enrichment that often happens from exile, from displacement, from adversity. Talks about God telling Abraham, Lech Lecha, and what comes out of his leaving his home, and the Babylonian Talmud superseding the Jerusalem Talmud as sort of a incredible product of exile, and an opportunity to find spiritual enrichment and even new closeness with God that we didn't necessarily find in the place we were more comfortable.
Yeah, well, there's something about orientation, just feeling, and that's what Michael Fishbein was describing, the normalcy that can lead people to be complacent. We assume that it is what it is, and we don't have to take responsibility for actively working to make it into what it can be. In the rupture, we see the whole expanse in front of us. And that's where the call to respond comes from. When something is whole, we don't necessarily see a way in. The brokenness invites us to show up.
What would you like to do now? Do you want to take more questions? Do you want to return to your material? Do you want to open the chat?
Maybe we'll keep going. I have some more stuff I want to make sure we get to. So we'll chat in a little bit. I hope you're all doing okay. Okay, thank you. So the next piece I want to take you to is Yehuda Halevi, another core text of exile, Libi b'mizrach, v'anochi b'sof ma'arav. My heart is in the east, and I in the uttermost west. How can I find savor in food? How shall it be sweet to me? How shall I render my vows and my bonds, while yet Zion lieth beneath the fetter of Edom, and I in Arab chains? A light thing would it seem to me to leave all the good things of Spain, seeing how precious in mine eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary. So there's so much. We could spend a lot of time on this. That notion of being in the East, my heart is in the East and I in the West, that being torn. So the dual consciousness of being in one place and in another is for me the quintessential description of the Jewish experience, that we should never get so at home that we don't know ourselves to be of this place and of another, which is both about physical home in this world, but also Jerusalem as the spiritual home, that we are not just flesh and blood, we are also animated by a relationship with the divine. And one of the things that I love about the hospital is that the divine realm is so present. It's like that veil that Mychal Fishbein talks about has been thinned in places where we need God the most. And that's really where I want to be spending my energy, in those places of the veil that's thin. It's where you can feel that yearning, and that heartbreak is so life-giving, of knowing that I am not just where I am. There is something more. And creating opportunities to engage more than just what is another aspect of this whole drama. So he ends by saying, seeing how precious in my eyes to behold the dust of the desolate sanctuary, Dvir Necherav. That's the Holy of Holies. The preciousness of the desolate. So it goes back actually to the social media question, because if we prize what looks good, we miss the preciousness of the desolate, right? So Yehuda Halevi is saying, a light thing it would seem to me to leave behind all the good things of Spain, to leave behind Facebook, in order to be in the face-to-face of the tears and the real life and the real story and the heart connections that are possible when I show up and somebody says, how are you? And I say, my heart is broken. And what happens then? Yehuda Halevi finds his place in that dust, because that is holy dust. And we have to learn to cherish our holy dust. Okay, now we're going to move over to Megillah. So this is from the Babylonian Talmud. As Rabbi Endelman said, the Babylonian Talmud is our central Talmud. The one in exile becomes the center. That's the Jewish paradox. And this passage is all about exile. So it's taught in a Braita, which is Mishnaic material or Tanaitic material. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai says, come and see how beloved the Jewish people are before the Holy One, blessed be he. As every place they were exiled, the divine presence went with them. They were exiled to Egypt, and the divine presence went with them. As it is stated, did I reveal myself to the house of your father when they were in Egypt? And that word revealed, haniglo nigleti, levet avicha b'yotam b'mitzrayim, which is from Shmuel, from Samuel. You can hear the word galut in niglo. So the rabbis do this fantastic midrashic reading, which is revelation and exile are hand in hand here. So what a stunning challenge. We've been talking about our exile, and now suddenly God is in exile with us. And it continues. They were exiled to Babylonia, and the divine presence went with them. As it is stated, for your sake, I have sent to Babylonia. So too, so for your sake, I've sent to Babylonia. So that comes from Isaiah. L'manchem shilachti bavela. It wasn't just that I sent you, but I was sent, meaning God was also present in Babylonia. So too, when in the future they will be redeemed, the divine presence will be with them, as it is stated, then the Lord your God will return with your captivity. It does not state he will bring back, i.e., he will cause the Jewish people to return, but rather it says he will return, which teaches that the Holy One, blessed be he, will return together with them from among the exiles. So again, these are all actual readings of the text. It doesn't say, Ve'ashiv, I will return you. It says, Veshav. Veshav Adonai Elokecha et shvutcha. So what does it mean that God is going to come back? It means that God is gone and God needs to come back. So too often when we talk about God, we talk about a God who is impervious to suffering. But in this midrash from the Talmud, what's clear is that God's position to us in our brokenness is with us, among us, broken with us. And just like we need to return, God needs to return. What a stunning invitation to intimacy with the divine who is not far away, but is close by. So this is the Shekhinah, the indwelling presence, comes to be known. But here, just through a close reading of those texts, we see these hints when the veil is pulled away, these hints of God being with us in this experience of our brokenness. And now I come to our last text, which is from Yehuda Amichai. You can find it on the internet in Hebrew if you're inclined to do that. So Yehuda Amichai is one of my favorite poets, probably my very favorite poet. And this poem is called Adam B'chayav, a man in his life, and it's based on Ecclesiastes. So for those of you who are familiar, the third chapter of Ecclesiastes begins, L'kol zman ve'et l'kol chefetz tachat hashamayim. For everything there is a season and a time for every purpose under heaven. And then there's a long list, a time for this and a time for that. And here's what Yehuda Amichai does with that. A man doesn't have time in his life to have time for everything. He doesn't have seasons enough to have a season for every purpose. Ecclesiastes was wrong about that. A man needs to love and to hate at the same moment, to laugh and cry with the same eyes, with the same hands to throw stones and to gather them, to make love in war and war in love, and to hate and forgive and remember and forget, to arrange and confuse, to eat and to digest what history takes years and years to do. A man doesn't have time. When he loses, he seeks. When he finds, he forgets. When he forgets, he loves. When he loves, he begins to forget. And his soul is seasoned. His soul is very professional. Only his body remains forever an amateur, chavav. He tries and it tries and it misses, gets muddled, mitbalbel, doesn't learn a thing, drunk and blind in its pleasures and its pains. He will die as figs die in autumn, shriveled and full of himself and sweet, the leaves growing dry on the ground, the bare branches pointing to the place where there's time for everything. So I want to open up the chat and hear your responses to that poem. I see some love for Amichai.
The chat is now open.
Holding two disparate things at once. Oi, yes. right? So that's our theme. That's the wholeness and the brokenness. We don't have time to have them be separate. They have to commingle. One of my absolute favorite poems. Amen. Classic Amichai. The Bible got it exactly right, except it got it totally wrong. You have to make choices in life. Biblical multitasking, if you will. I'm loving these responses. It seems that materialism is unidimensional. I'm not sure I understand what that is. Betsy, you might want to come back again and tell me what you mean. This was good to have a new perspective of the pandemic, as it is obvious that home sheltering as an older adult will last a while. I identify with your here I am as I spend my time going through my papers and organizing my photographs and choose Zooms of the many available like this one I am grateful for. Thank you. Thank you for joining, Lynn. Thank you. Captures humanity, brought tears to my eyes. What is the name of the poem? So A Man in His Life. You can find it on the internet if you put in A Man in His Life. It's also in a the selected poetry of Yehuda Amichai, translated by Hannah Block and Stephen Mychal. By turning the Bible on its head, Amichai opens a new way of looking at our lives and time. Yes, he does. That is his very special talent. That the spiritual has dimension, but the body disintegrates. Yes. Life is continuous cognitive dissonance. Yes. It understands the original concept of simultaneous brokenness and wholeness. Yes. When there is not a set time for every individual experience, this poem teaches me the importance of movement, and that when we are not stagnant in one emotion, we are able to experience the wholeness. That's so beautiful. These are all so beautiful. Thank you. The hardest part of doing our session in this way is not actually being able to have so much of a conversation. I'm not used to that. Even during COVID, I've been having all of my groups in person with social distancing, because it just broke my heart to be on a computer all day, which I know we don't usually have so much choice in, but since we all work in the hospital anyway, I've managed to find large conference rooms to accommodate us. Reading this poem today actually gave me one of the Fishbein breakthrough feelings. Oh, Ben, what more can I say? That's phenomenal. This is brokenness. This brokenness is bringing smiles and happiness to you and thus to all of us. What a paradox, right? I think that it's the move to push away the brokenness drains our energy. The sitting in the brokenness is when we discover that it's not the end. Brokenness is not the end. I had one day, when the height of the pandemic was so horrific and took everyone's breath away, literally. It was too horrible. And I was very grateful that I got to walk to and from work. I live on the other side of the park. So I walked to and from work every day, and that's when I would weep sometimes as I felt the anguish of the people I was caring for. And it was the weeping that kept me whole, because I'd have to come in the next day and be open to more stories. And if I hadn't been able to weep, I couldn't have come back the next day. I think of the seasons fall and spring as being an embodiment of this. In fall, when everything is dying, we are blessed with plenty, the harvest. And in spring, the season on new life, there is actually very little available to eat. That is so fantastic. So I was thinking about fall and where we are right now at the end of fall. Is fall ending today, tomorrow? Right now. And this image at the end of figs dying in autumn, shriveled and full of himself and sweet, right? Like, again, that paradox. You would think shriveled, not necessarily full of himself, because he's shriveled. What does it mean to be full of himself? The Hebrew is something maleh, and sweet, like, yes, as fruit becomes overripe, it becomes sweet. And so for some people, we like it really sweet. depending on our taste buds. Other people don't like it quite so sweet. But again, that paradox that as we're approaching death, there is a sweetness there. And ultimately, that dying will turn into, he talks about the leaves growing on the ground, the mulch will be turned into the ground itself that will give birth into that spring. And it's only then, and that's where he ends, when he says that pointing to the place, heaven, where there's time for everything. As long as we're in this world, we have to balance the brokenness and the wholeness. And in a kind of, I think, a rare Amichai moment, he points, maybe ironically, and then it wouldn't be so rare for Amichai, that the time for everything is not in this world. So we shouldn't be so eager to have a time for everything. Let's hold on to needing to do everything at once. Let's embrace the human experience of holding the brokenness and the wholeness together. Okay, I'm scrolling back through our text so I don't miss them. To reveal is to remove the veil. Love. Fishbein uses the word to mean the ultimate breakthrough. Who removes the veil, us or God? Oh, Shelley, what a great question. So in this, my understanding is, now I could be getting this wrong, is that it's an experience. Fishbein begins with experience. So the experience is the experience of the veil being removed, and he's less concerned about who does the removing. So we can ready ourselves for the removal of that veil through activities of attunement to that which goes beyond ourselves. But we're not in charge of it wholly either, is how I would understand it. So for those of us who have a relationship to God, I would say that in my own life, I have felt God's presence removing that veil for me. But then at other times, I have felt God's distance and a deep yearning for the activity of the divine that could help me out, and not receiving it. And in that yearning, there were sometimes possibilities of that veil being removed. And so I think of it as being a back and forth, again, that blurring of the binary, that the veil can be moved or removed by circumstance, by divine intervention, by mystery. And when it happens, the great gift of feeling that I am part of something larger, and that's the meaning that doesn't rest in me, that helps to give clarity to what my purpose is here, the here I am that I can respond to. I think your question was better than my response, so I hope you'll forgive me, but I was just doing my best. Please give the full reference for Fishbein's The Sacred Center. Okay, hold on. I think I can do that. So I quote it in my theory papers, and if I'm lucky, my theory papers will pop out at me, and if I'm not lucky, they won't. And they're not.
It looks like it was an essay in a memorial volume for Nachum Glatzer, Some Biblical Concepts of Sacred Place.
Yes, and what's the title of it?
The title of the article is, or the chapter is, The Sacred Center, the Symbolic Structure of the Bible. But I haven't been having much luck actually finding it, so it might be behind some academic.
Okay, but that is the article. I told you, I would have thought it would be somewhat dry, but no, it stayed with me for all these years. It's one of the most important articles I've ever read. The Tracy Chapman song, Why, has a lot of contradictions too. I'm going to have to go listen to that. I love Tracy Chapman. Judaism teaches to hold joy and sadness in each hand. Yes, yes. We can say bye to the binary. This feels like loving recognition of how broken we are and how hard we try. We do. From my mother's Latin lessons, Lachromi rerum. There are tears for things. I probably mispronounced that terribly. Yeah. Fall ends on December 21st. Oh, I was way off. Thank you. The Frank Sinatra song, "It Was a Very Good Year." Yes, and as there is less water, the sweetness is condensed. Ooh. Well, you know, as I age and my water, my skin's moisture comes out, so it's nice for me to think that I'm getting sweeter too. So from a deep introspective seminar, I will be recording Torah for my B'nai Mitzvah students this afternoon with a renewed inward-outward view of life. Beautiful. It is immortality. It is mortality that gives life meaning. If we were immortal, life would have no meaning. Yeah, that is the great paradox. There is no life without death. It is the bad that enables the good. Anger has no place in this. It is the bad that enables the good. Anger has no place in this. Concerning what has been said before, I have had that rupture, which followed logically what had been going on before that. The rupture took me down a new path, which had become inevitable. So I'm not sure what this means, but I sense that it is full of meaning. So ruptures takes down a new path. And then the new path becomes the inevitable one. So there is a flow that happens. That's the part that I do understand. Thank you for sharing that. Nothing like the birth of a first grandson to make us aware of mortality for us and the new creature. Yes. I'm glad Adam and Eve did not eat from the tree of life. Well, if they had, they would have been the only people on the earth. Lisa Mychal. Oh, that is too cool. So Lisa was my Chumash and Mishnah teacher when I was in 8th grade at Solomon Schechter in Boston. And here she is. I'm reflecting on feeling old and young at the same time. You look exactly like you did in 8th grade, yet I sound so much older. That is so sweet. And that is a moment that never would have been possible without being on Zoom together in this way. Lisa, I am so grateful to you, and I think of you often. Lisa hosted my entire 8th grade class for Shabbos. She was a very brave woman. I love the idea of allowing the sorrow and loss out, allowing the flow so that we can stay alive. The alternative is to lock out part of life, to go to sleep, cut off empathy, shut ourselves down. Thank you. Beautifully articulated. It can be scary. We can be afraid of where it will lead us. And yet we lose so much more when we don't let it in. The bridge of the 90s hit song From a Distance says, God is watching us from a distance, which works as broken, God is distant, and as whole, God is noticing. Beautiful. Anything real, Shlomo Carlebach Zal taught, is full of contradictions. And he also wrote, a real niggun has to have all of the emotions all at once. I love that. Thank you, Shelley. Rambam said, walk in the center of the path. Beautiful. How do patients react to this? Great question. If we feel far away from God, who moved? Yes. Okay. So how do patients react to this? I'm just going to look at a couple more and then I'm going to come back to that. How can Judaism help explain the truth of those who were unable to see the wholeness? Sadly, the message did not get through. I have endless compassion and identification with people who can't see the wholeness. As somebody who has felt the impossibility of feeling that wholeness through stretches in my life, I think that patience and love in that broken yearning is the only possibility that allows for the shift to happen when it happens. And in the meantime, not to be alone.
Rabbi Springer, maybe, I know there was a question you wanted to respond to, and maybe you can also, thinking maybe you can also share with us, you're in such a unique position that the rest of us are not, in seeing and responding to and managing the profound spiritual and and psychological, in addition to physical effects of the pandemic. And maybe if you can talk to us about how you apply some of this material in your, actually in your pastoral counseling with your patients, with the chaplains that you're training, for yourself personally. I think we would love to hear some of that in addition to whatever other questions you want to respond to.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm sorry to people whose texts I'm not going to, whose chats I'm not going to read out loud, but I hope everybody else has a chance to read them because they're also very beautiful and rich. So I was sitting with somebody a week ago who was weeping, in that weeping of everything falling apart. And for me, these teachings are with me in a way that enables me to hold on to the possibilities of wholeness, even in those moments of greatest weeping, which allows me not to have to rush in to try to offer a false repair, but in the relationship itself, holding on to the possibilities of wholeness conveys the space to be in the brokenness. So the image of going into a pit, that the sitting in the pit needs to be respected, and then the possibility of emerging out of the pit becomes more real. And after my own experiences, both as somebody in the pit and as somebody who has visited in the pit a lot, that holding of the this and the that, of the brokenness and the wholeness together, means that the weeping person is not only broken, but is also whole. And when I see people through that lens, it gives permission, even for the person who is feeling most vulnerable, to also experience themselves as having the wholeness that they're able to connect with as everything falls apart. Because in the falling apart, it comes together in new ways. And that's the here I am. In feeling met in the who I am and in this moment, that's where the possibilities come from.
I also had some, did you finish what you were at that?
Yeah.
I had some questions privately earlier, some more questions about God and about theology of suffering, and you were just talking for a little while about how we relate to God in the midst of suffering. I don't know if that's something that you want to speak more about.
How we relate to God in our suffering?
Yeah, and how it impacts the nature of our theology. Do we the idea of believing in a God that sees my personal suffering and has something to do with it, or is responding in some way, or not that kind of, the way one of the questions put it was micromanaging God, but something less involved in the specifics of each person's life.
So I think the paradox that I live with is that I don't believe in a micromanaging God, but I do believe in a God who shows up. So there is something that happens in the opening of the heart that invites in the divine in transforming ways, or can. And so I think a personal relationship with the divine is possible. And that doesn't mean that I have God in my pocket, or that I'm sheltered from suffering. So suffering is part of life. And the reason that I'm so drawn to that passage from Mychal, the midrash of God going into exile with us, is because God who embraces the true texture of human existence and is not is not busy elsewhere, but is deeply concerned with us, is a God who doesn't abandon us. And for me, my greatest anguish in certain periods of my depression was feeling abandoned. And the image of God turning God's face away from us is a very powerful biblical articulation of feeling that abandonment. We need God's face, just like we need all of our faces, and our faces are connected to the face of the divine. So the more we attune ourselves to the divine in the world, the less anguished some of the why questions can become. And they can be understood as the expression of pain as we go through what can be torment that doesn't need to make God's presence in our lives an impossibility. But here's another place where I think anger is very helpful, that even anger at the divine is a relationship with the divine and welcomes us to stay in connection. And as long as we are fostering that connection, then even the things that feel most difficult to understand can not be barriers. They can be sources of pain, but the pain itself doesn't shut us down if we allow ourselves to engage with it and let it be part of that flow of the brokenness and the wholeness, and a description of human existence as it really is, and yet bound inextricably with the miraculousness of this world and existence.
So when I was, at some point when I was doing chaplaincy training in Revival school, someone said, and I'm almost positive it was not you, everyone believes in God in the hospital. So I wonder if, well, I guess if that's, if that sounds true to you based on your experience, and B, if it is, or if there's a kind of a resurgence of trying to connect to God in the hospital. Do you see it as kind of a productive, complex way of relating to God, a vessel for holding a variety of difficult feelings and hopes as you're talking about, or is it more sort of something out of desperation that doesn't necessarily make room for a nuanced kind of faith?
Well, I'm certain that I did not say that everyone believes in God in the hospital, because I don't believe that's true. I do think that when we are in distress, we often connect with what Carrie Doring calls embedded theology, the theology that we might have thought we overcame, that was part of our childhood, that was part of our early formation, and maybe we moved away from it as we became more intellectually oriented. We had ideas to wrestle with, and those embedded beliefs may have transformed into what she would call deliberative beliefs, a faith that takes more account of more nuance. And yet those embedded beliefs are still part of us. And I'm a big believer in encouraging people not to worry about being inconsistent. There's enough room, like in the Mychal poem, we love and we forget, and it all happens together. So we believe and we don't believe, and we believe this way and we believe that way. And we're a bundle of contradictions because we're just trying to find our way in this complicated world. And I don't hold anybody, I don't feel that it's a diminishment to say in my faith life, I hold things that can't possibly be held together, and yet I hold them.
You remind me of how the way I relate to God always shifts on the high holidays into something, more like that embedded theology. And yeah, I've also sort of tried to let go of worrying about the inconsistency of that. I just got a powerful question that maybe we just have a few minutes left that maybe you can address. So Barbara writes, what about the people who were unable to take these messages and overcome their pain and took their own lives? Why is it not able to be heard by everyone? Why then does Judaism consider taking one's own life a sin? Where is the consolation and explanation of wholeness?
Thank you for that question. I don't consider taking one's own life a sin. So we know that suicide rates and suicidal ideation has grown exponentially during COVID. My daughter wrote a piece in the New York Times that, wait a minute. There is no vaccine for teenage despair was the title of her op-ed. And she was speaking as a kid whose friend committed suicide. And she wanted to make sure that she was participating in lifting away the silence that just adds to people's suffering. I don't think of people who die in that way as having failed. I think it's a complicated process of feeling that one can't be alive in this form. And my heart goes towards compassion. And my prayer is that we can continue to reach out to one another and make more life possible whenever it is possible, and have endless compassion when it isn't.
Thank you for pointing us to your daughter's op-ed. I also, in my network, there was a teen suicide last week, which is just, so heartbreaking. So, so thanks for sharing that wisdom, and also your daughter's piece, which I think is coming from a teen, a caring, aware teen, is really powerful. So we just have a couple of minutes left if you want to share any concluding thoughts with us.
Well, it's been really beautiful for me to be able to be with all of you. I would much rather be able to hear far more from you. Never quite comfortable being the talker. I live mostly in the world of listening. So I hope that there's been something in here that is enriching for you as you continue in the days that are darkening as we head towards the darkest part of the year. And if I can participate with you in feeling some of the wholeness that lives even in the brokenness, then that's good.
Getting a lot of messages of, I'm getting a lot of private chats of thanks to you, Rabbi Springer, from many corners, and actually also a request for if you can recommend recommended reading about the idea of suffering and brokenness that can lead to wholeness and spiritual enrichment.
So the book that I quoted from, the Estelle Frankel, Sacred Therapy, Jewish Spiritual Teachings on Emotional Healing and Inner Wholeness, is a wonderful resource. And she takes you through and has exercises. And I would say that's a great place to start. There's another book. I'm not having such luck pulling stuff off my shelf, but Simcha Weintraub edited a volume on healing psalms that are the Nachman of Bratslav healing psalms. I'm just trying to remember the exact title of the book. Anybody? If you just look up Simcha Weintraub psalms, you can find that. It's a slim volume, but each psalm is beautifully explicated.
Well, someone note that it was published by the National Jewish Healing Center. Thank you so much, Rabbi Springer, for sharing this hard one wisdom with us, hard one in your own life as you shared with us, and also in the work that you do. It gives a whole different level of credibility to what you're saying, and you've articulated, I think, some very comforting messages really helpfully for us. So thank you so much for teaching us today. And
Thank you.
I know that I and some of your other former students who are on the call have really been especially grateful to learn with you again. I want to invite everyone back for our next week's session, which is with Professor Alan Cooper and our Bible faculty about the certainty of uncertainty, meaning it's a certainty that that uncertainty is a fact of life, and how exploring how biblical texts help us manage the challenges of doubt and offer ways to meet those trials with hope and faith and trust. So it should be a very nice follow-up to today, and hope to see many of you there. I wish everyone in the meantime, at least all Americans in any case, a healthy and hopefully happy Thanksgiving, however you may be marking it this year. Take care, everyone.